Alright, we're back with episode number 5 of the educational speedrun series. In this game, we're playing against Nahugu, rated 865, and we're starting off with a rating of 871 here ourselves. So we're playing our caro-kann against e4. Our opponent goes for bishop c4, which we have seen, I believe, in one of the earlier games, in one of the other episodes. Generally not a great move for white to play. They're pretty much walking right into our d5 pawn break. Now the bishop ends up retreating. We can go ahead and play e5 and put 2 pawns in the center of the board. I think that's perfectly fine. If white does get to play d4, then they'll at least be able to equalize the space in the center. That being said, I don't really see why not, quite honestly. Let's go ahead and play e5 and just grab that space, develop the knights, get the bishop in the game, castle the king, and play with our extra space. So white goes for queen f3. They are attacking the pawn on d5. Let's go ahead and play knight f6 to simply protect the pawn. And if we're able to keep the pawn on on d5 held in place, then this bishop on b3 is going to be very pretty useless, I would say. So what I'm going to do here, it looks like white might be playing bishop g5. I could simply play h3 to prevent that from happening, and then the bishop doesn't really have a way to influence the d5 pawn. Another option here is to play knight c6 and try to get the knight to d4 as soon as possible, because that would attack the queen as well as the bishop on b3. So I could go knight c6, bishop g5, knight d4, queen moves away somewhere. I think playing like that would be perfectly fine, but I think I will just play h6 first. Let's just, always make sure that your center is well protected and secured. h6 doesn't really guard the center, but it does prevent my opponent from attacking the center. They go knight c3 to attack the pawn. I can simply play bishop to e6 to defend it. And if white throws in a check, I'll just block with the knight on c6. And yeah, we're just keeping a pretty large space advantage in the middle of the board. We're going to develop the bishop pretty soon. He decides to go for the trade. I'll simply recapture. Now the d5 pawn is really solidly defended here. We also now have the pair of bishops, which is pretty nice. A space advantage, which is good. We have the half-open b file we can use at the right time. Here I'm going to go for bishop to d6, just developing, again, reinforcing the pawn. And now we have ideas even of stuff like bishop to g4. I guess white could move the queen to g3. We push the e pawn. I think I'm just going to castle first, honestly. Let's just get castled and just no need for any fancy stuff going on here. And he plays the move h4. Not really sure what this move is all about. I think I will go ahead and play... bishop to g4 now, just to harass the queen. If the queen goes to the e3 square, we can play d4 to attack the queen as well as the knight. If the queen goes to g3, then there might be some lineups we can make use of, targeting the queen in the future. Okay, the queen does go to e3. This does walk into a fork. We go pawn to d4, attacking both the queen and the knight. If the knight decides to take on d4, we'll still take back and make another fork. And it looks like white gets 2 pawns out of this, if they do take the pawn on d4. However, the problem is, even if they do get those 2 pawns for the knight, we will actually have a tactic with bishop h2 check, and then capturing the queen on the d4 square, because we'll have this discovered attack that's available towards the queen. Now, if white does not take the pawn, they'll have to move the queen, we'll take the knight, we'll be up 2 pieces rather than just 1, and so we'll have a very large advantage at that point. Okay, maybe they did see that this tactic was available. That being said, we still capture the knight anyways. The queen is probably going to take back. They are attacking this pawn. I don't think the pawn is the biggest problem in the world to lose, but I also don't really think we need to lose it at the same time. I'm just going to go for rook c8 to protect it. Probably I'll drop the bishop back, move the queen in front, try to attack in the kingside direction. White plays f3, which is a bit risky to expose their king a bit further. I think I will just retreat the bishop, though. We can play knight to d5, queen takes h4, that's also available. And also some checks on the diagonal towards the king are also in the air. Let's go for knight d5, attack the queen and the pawn. Probably white has to move the queen up the board to keep the pawn defended. It is a very risky location for the queen, though. Once again, if this knight on d5 was gone, then I would have a bishop check followed by taking the queen. So maybe in that regard, I'll actually play the move knight to b4, attacking the c2 pawn. But other than attacking the pawn, I'm also threatening to give the check followed by taking the queen. There's probably also many other moves that were good here, but we'll go for this one and see what white decides to do. Pretty hard to defend against both of these threats at the same time. Maybe they should play queen to f2 to guard the pawn. They play rook f2 instead, though. Here we can give the check. King has to take, or has to deal with the check first, and then we'll take the queen on d4 afterwards. We're also attacking the rook. We're also attacking the pawn. And yeah, not much white can do at this point. Let's take here with check. I guess we'll just line up towards the rook. We'll go ahead and I guess we'll just take this pawn. Then we'll move the bishop. We'll trade the rooks, invade on the e file, get down to the e1 square. That is our checkmate threat. Queen f2 check is available if the bishop goes to d2. Here we'll just take the bishop. I guess we can just trade the rooks, I suppose. And we'll just line up to attack the g2 pawn next. Throw in this check. They block with the pawn. Okay, here we're going to play queen takes g2, checkmate next move, and nothing white can do about it. And they decide to resign. Okay, so we got a pretty efficient win here, I think. I think the biggest problem that white ran into, not only was the start of the game with the bishop c4 opening not that great, I would say that's the main issue that they ran into. They allowed us to get a big space advantage. They didn't really develop the rest of their pieces all that well. h4 was an odd move. But yeah, again, we'll go to the game review area and check out the game there and take a look at it. All right, so in the game review area here, we played at a 93.6% accuracy. We had one inaccuracy, and everything else was pretty good, so let's check the game out. Our opponent played at 78.5. Let's analyze it here. So opening-wise, e4, c6, bishop c4. Not a great starting off way to play the opening. We do simply get a space advantage. Apparently e5 is not the best move. I guess white could play d4 here and gain a little bit of space themselves. But as the game progressed, we did just maintain our space advantage. I guess knight c6 was also good, as I was thinking about during the game. Something like this looks perfectly good for black, of course. I just decided to play h6 first, then bishop e6, knight c6, and really just through the first 9 moves of the game, we already have a space advantage in the center of the board. We have the bishop pair. White's queen goes to f3, which means it's going to be able to, we're going to be able to attack it a bit more as the game progresses. So mostly we're just taking advantage of our opponent breaking opening principles and playing kind of not very solid moves. Not really a whole lot fancy for us to do. We just put pawns in the center, develop our pieces. Eventually, I do play bishop g4 to hit the queen. Yeah, and in this position, white pretty much has to play the move queen to g3. We saw that queen to e3 walked into the fork. If they had played queen to g3, I think I was either going to play e4 or d4. I'm not entirely sure. Apparently d4 is good. If the knight moves away, we can take the knight on e2. And if white tries to counterattack us with f3, probably lots of moves are good. You can play e4, you can take the knight first and then e4, and a lot of things are attacked in white's position, and black is doing pretty well at this point. Instead, though, they went to e3. This allows us to make this fork, and then I think that they realized here that if they take the pawn, we were going to have the bishop h2 check followed by taking the queen. So I think in that regard, white did not recapture on d4. But if that was the case, then they shouldn't have taken on d4 in the first place. They should just play queen to d2 and then do something like this. But we would still be up a piece with a very good position, of course. So as things progressed, we're now ahead 2 pieces. We eventually got that tactic happening later anyways with bishop h2 check followed by queen takes queen, and the game was over at this point. Took a couple extra moves, but we eventually got the win here. So yeah, that's it for our first game. Let's go ahead and get into our second one. All right, game number 2 here, playing against M Galtham 24, rated 909. And I think this is the second game in the speedrun series where our opponent is just giving up the pawn with pawn to e5. As I mentioned in the previous episode where this happened, a lot of our this actually ended up happening a lot of times in the Ready Nimso Larsen speedrun series that I did in the past. We play knight f3, opponents play e5. They only thought for, you know, it shows 0.5 seconds, and now they're starting to realize, oh wait a second, I shouldn't have played e5 so quick. I don't know why people have, you know, why they just blitz the move out. Not really sure. Okay, we grab the pawn. We're just going to retreat and just put pawns in the center. Nothing too fancy here. Let's go see d4. Not really sure what knight g4 is about. I don't know if he plans on sacrificing. I'm just going to go for e4 and grab that space. I could have also played h3, but then he goes back to f6 and he's stopping me from playing e4. So I can always play h3 later. I might as well just grab the space with e4 right away, is my thinking. Let's just go bishop to d3 to defend the pawn. Again, general MO as we're seeing a lot of these games, we grab the space advantage if our opponent gives it to us, and we just defend the pawns in the center. Next I'm going to play h3 finally to kick the knight backwards. If the knight goes back to f6, we'll push the pawn to e5 and make the fork. If it goes back to h6, I can also play e5 and kick this bishop around. This bishop is in a really bad location. I can probably trap this bishop very soon as well. I think I'll take the bishop on, or oh sorry, I'll take the knight on h6 first, just to eliminate that piece. The white doesn't recapture. Okay, I'll just I'll just retreat the bishop back to safety. No big deal. Let's go here and hit the queen. And then I think I'll just develop the knight. I can also still go e5. Maybe I'll e5. I guess the bishop goes back to e7. Yeah, let's just develop the knight. I don't think we need to do anything super fancy. E5 now. They might be able to take my knight attacking my queen. I take back. They get the bishop on g5, but I get the rook in the corner of the board. Or I get the bishop on d6. I think that this works fine. We attack the queen, and we were also attacking the bishop. I think he completely missed that the queen was being hit, because now we can just take the queen. And okay, he's going to continue fighting on. Let's go d5 just to block the bishop out. We're happy to trade pieces when our opponent is behind. I think this guy's just giving us everything. I don't know how educational this particular game is going to be, since he's kind of just handing away all the free pieces at this point, but it is what it is. We get the win. I'll analyze it in the game review real fast, but yeah, probably we'll just quickly get on to game number 3. So let's go over to the game review for a moment and check it out. Alright, so we unsurprisingly played at a 98.0% accuracy. If our opponent is just going to give us free material every couple of moves, it's going to be pretty hard to play a bad game. So knight f3, e5. He played this in half a second. I'm pretty sure this is almost just pre-moved at this point, or very close to it. So of course, no complaints there. We capture the pawn. I'm pretty sure people who are playing e5 that quickly on move number 1 are really just expecting that everybody plays e4. But you could also make the argument that even if I played d4 on move 1, e5 is also still pretty bad, because I would just take the pawn. So pre-moving e5 is very, very risky, because, you know, 2 of the main moves in the start of the game kind of make it so that e5 is a bad response. So we're able to just grab the pawn for free. We retreat, gain space. I just decided to gain more space. I could have hit the knight first. I think a lot of people would have done this. But after the knight goes back, then we can't play the pawn to e4. It's still, of course, a great position for white, but I figured let's grab the space when it is offered to us. Then defend the pawn, castle, h3, and yeah, black is just losing material here. If the knight goes backwards, e5 makes a fork. In the case of knight h6, we took that. He didn't recapture for whatever reason. If he had recaptured, though, I was still going to play e5. This is the only safe square for the bishop on b4, and then we can just go something like c3, b4, and we can trap the bishop on the a5 square. So that would have been the plan if black had taken my bishop. He didn't, though. I hit the queen, developed, opened up this attack on the queen. I think black's best move is definitely to take this knight and hope that we somehow mess up here. Because if we do take the bishop and they take our bishop, now that there's no knight protecting it, in this particular case, it still is great for us because we can take the bishop or the rook. But if for whatever reason we couldn't take the bishop or the rook, black would actually be equal on material in terms of piece count. That being said, of course, we can just, we can take one of these two pieces for free. The computer says both are good. I might have taken the bishop, quite honestly. We're just up a piece for free, get everything in the game. Black is in terrible shape in a case like this. So in the game, though, he didn't move the queen. We took it, and he just kept giving stuff up. The game is over here. Not a whole lot to say about this one. He gave us a free pawn on move number 1, gave us a free piece a couple moves later, and yeah, we just got the win here. So let's go into our third and final game for this episode, and we'll play that one there. All right, so in this particular game, we are playing our third one. We're playing against Tayuya Fan, rated 926. We're going to go for our caro-kann against this e4 move. So they decided to play the advanced variation. So what I'm going to be doing against the advanced variation, there's two main ways of playing in this position. You can either play pawn to c5 right away, which I think is probably one of the more popular and common ways of playing nowadays, or you can play bishop f5, which is kind of the more historic way of playing. Somewhat similar to the normal, let's say, classical version of the caro-kann, where our opponents play knight c3. In that particular case, I'm going to take the pawn and then play bishop f5, which is also a little bit more of a historic, kind of more common in the past way of playing. I'm actually going to do the bishop f5 move in this speedrun as well. It's a little bit different. A lot of people are becoming more and more familiar with the c5 move. And maybe at this particular rating level it doesn't matter that much, but I'm gonna kind of branch out a little bit here, and I'm gonna play the bishop f5 setup. Now this still means that we're gonna play c5 in the future, but rather than playing it right away, we're gonna prepare it and play a little bit later. So my opponent plays f4, which does reinforce the e5 pawn, but it does create some additional light square weaknesses that they'll have to be careful about. I think against this, I can go for e6. I can go for h5. Let's see. Probably I will go for... I'm kind of just leaning towards e6, quite honestly. Let's just go for that. If white tries some kind of crazy g4 move to attack the bishop, then we can play queen h4 check, attacking the king as well as the g-pawn. So g4 doesn't really work here. They decide to go for bishop to d3 instead. Generally speaking, we are happy to exchange off these light square bishops, because after those bishops are gone, white is left over with a bad dark square bishop. And we're pretty much playing almost like a French defense at this point, at least in terms of the pawn structure in the center of the board. However, in the French defense, one of the biggest problems with that opening, or one of the biggest downsides, is that you do have the bishop on c8 stuck behind that pawn structure. In this case, though, we've already gotten it outside of the pawns, traded it off, and now we have a good bishop compared to our opponent's bad bishop, again, if we're talking about the pawns in the center of the board. So I'm going to go ahead and play c5. It's a good pawn break to work towards still. White decides to give a check with their queen. They are forking the king, the pawn on c5, and the pawn on b7. I'm going to go ahead and play queen to d7. If I go knight c6, white could take on c5 or take on b7. So I'm just going to go queen d7 and offer a trade of queens. And I'm probably going to take, let's see, kind of leaning towards taking with the king, quite honestly. Because if I take with the knight and white plays pawn to c3, it becomes a little bit hard for my knight on d7 to attack the d4 pawn. Whereas if I take with the king, I can play knight to c6 to attack that pawn. So let's go knight c6. Could also trade pawns first, but let's go knight c6 to begin with. I don't really want to rush trading the pawns and it it can help white to develop their knight to the c3 square. Here, though, white is potentially looking to take this pawn. I don't think it's really that concerning, though, because I can play this move knight h6, and I can try to get the knight to the g4 or f5 squares to attack the bishop. And like a move like knight f5 right now, actually now that I'm saying this, knight f5 is a very strong move, because we attack the bishop as well as the pawn that's on d4. And no matter how white saves the bishop, we're going to be able to take this pawn on d4 here. Now, do I take with my c6 knight or my f5 knight? I'm leaning towards the f5 knight. I'm now threatening the fork on c2. Now I'm still threatening the fork on c2. I am also just up a pawn for free at this point. I guess I'll go ahead and play rook to c8. Again, still threatening the fork. I can also go for bishop to b4, pinning the knight. And here I can win material. I can take the knight on e2, which forces the king to recapture since the knight on c3 was pinned. Then I can take on c3 a couple of times, and I'm just ahead 2 pawns at this point. So let's go b6 to keep that pawn safe, double up the rooks, invade on the second rank. I don't really want to trade rooks because it opens up their rook. I'll just double up the rooks first. And now I can check on the c2 square, pick up an additional pawn. Rook check here is available for a skewer in some situations. Here, I guess I can check on c4. And I can check on g3. Maybe now I will actually end up trading off the rooks at this point. Then I can check on c2. And I can check on c3. Here, though, I'm going to play the move pawn to a5. And the pawn on b3 is the target here. So I think now I'll just move my... Let's say I move my king up the board. Push this pawn. Make a pass pawn. We'll push it again. Slide the king down the board. Push the a-pawn. Not a whole lot that white can do to stop all of this. We do have to play quickly, though. We only have 24 seconds left on the clock. Let's push this. Recapture. Put the rook behind the pawn. Move the king up the board. Hit the rook. Make a queen. He's going to give a few checks. Take there. All we have to do is avoid some kind of stalemate situation. Here I think we are going to be pretty close to a checkmate somehow. Something like this. Guess I'll just pin the rook. He trades rooks, that's checkmate on the g3 square. And we get the win. Okay, so I had to speed up a little bit there at the end to convert the advantage, but we were up 2 pawns without really any compensation for our opponent. So let's go to the game review and check out this game. All right, we played at a 96.2% accuracy here, it looks like. We had no mistakes, no inaccuracies, no misses or blunders, 1 great move, and our opponent played at 87.0. So let's check the game out here. So e4, c6, d4, d5, our opponent goes for the advanced variation. As I mentioned during the game, there's 2 main ways of playing here. You can play c5, which is probably the more common way of playing nowadays, quite honestly. The idea here with c5 is you're just looking to immediately strike at the opponent's center. There's lots of ways white can play around this. They can take the pawn at the master level and above. That's the most common move. Knight f3 is very common as well. Pawn to c3 is somewhat similar to what we saw in the game in terms of a similar looking pawn structure. Yeah, lots of ways white can play there. Bishop f5 is also a good move as well. Historically speaking, this is the more common move. Has somewhat been replaced by c5 in recent years, but still a very good move for black to play. You develop the bishop, then you play e6, then you play c5, and you get a bit more of a, let's say, strategic maneuvering type of game a lot of the times, whereas the c5 variations tend to be a bit more like dynamic and open board type of positions. Um, it's not that one or the other is inherently better or worse or anything like that. It just is a preference point. You can play c5 or bishop f5. I'm going to go with bishop f5 in this particular speedrun. I think there's lots of resources showing the c5 move, and I want to, maybe show some examples of how bishop f5 can still be a good move. So a couple of main ways for white to play here. H4 is one of the most common options. The idea here is that white is setting a little bit of a trap. If black just autopilots with the move e6, white will go g4, h5, f3, and you'll get your bishop trapped. So h4 gains space, but also sets a little bit of a trap. The best move here is to play h5 ourselves, just to stop white from doing that. But then you can still play e6, c5, knight c6, stuff like that. White's argument with the h4, h5 moves is that they can play moves like bishop g5 at the right time. Maybe not right away necessarily, but it does become a useful idea. Let's say something like this, for example. This is one of the main lines, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And yeah, this is a position that's perfectly good for white, and also perfectly good for black. So anyways, though, our opponent in this game went for the move f4, which is not the best way of doing things. The drawback is it does block in the bishop on c1. Even though it does gain white a bit more space, it also leaves some weaknesses in their position at the same time. So I went for e6, bishop d3. I decided to trade the bishops right away. The computer seems to prefer the move knight h6 a little bit more, which does make a lot of sense. If white's going to take us, we get to improve the knight, whereas if we take them, we help them to improve the queen. So you could make the argument here that the tension between the bishops is not something we should rush to exchange right away. But okay, I decided to exchange, played c5. This is our main pawn break that we want to go for in this pawn structure. White gave a check, which is not that great of a move. Usually you're pretty happy to play in-games when you're playing the caro-kann in general, or the French defense for that matter. You're behind on space a little bit, so usually the more pieces that come off the board, the better it is for the player who's behind on space. But also at the same time, there's many situations where we'll be able to take the pawn on d4 and kind of make it into a bit of a weakness. And we have no weaknesses on our own side of the board. So if your opponent has a weakness and you don't, usually it's pretty good in an in-game to have that kind of situation. So white decided to take us. I took back with the king, and then I was able to play knight c6. The computer likes taking on d4 first a little bit more, but I don't think it makes that big of a difference. Knight h6. h3 was a big mistake from our opponent, and now allowed the move knight f5, and now we're attacking both the bishop and the d4 pawn, and there's just really no way for white to guard both. They can guard the bishop, but they can't guard the pawn at the same time. And in the game, that's what happened. We won the pawn on d4. Even if white tries to push our knight away from protecting d4, we can either play knight to e3, just to block that off, or we can even take the pawn on c3, because if they take our knight, we take on b2 and trap the rook. So little tactics help out there. In the game, though, we're simply up a pawn. We develop our pieces. We were able to win another pawn based on our opponent's mistake. And then, simply put, we're just up 2 pawns. I didn't trade on b3 right away, but I did do this a little bit later in the game. Kept my a pawn alive. And then really, as I've talked about in plenty of episodes in the past, when you have extra material, especially in the endgame phase, if you're up a pawn, just use your extra pawn and push it down the board. I'm not doing anything on the king side here. I'm not touching these pawns. One of my extra pawns is here on the queen side, where I have a 2 versus 1 situation, and I'm just working on pushing that side of the board. So a3, eventually a2, rook a3 threatens to promote, move the king down the board, make the queen, and as the game went on, we eventually got the checkmate, and that's the way the things finished out here. Okay, so that's it for the 3 games in this episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed them. If you want to see the rest of the speedrun episodes, you'll want to take a look at the playlist to the left of the video here, and that will allow you to check out the other episodes. That's it for this one, though. Hope you have enjoyed this one, and I'll see you around the next one.